Okay, thanks to you all, and welcome to this FMG session on the U.S. election and how it is related to our focus of work, WTO reform. No, I mean, first, my apologies because this is probably the first time we do two sessions back to back. The day before yesterday, we did one on climate change and trade, which was good. The simple reason is that many things are happening, and many big things are happening, which will have an impact on them and on our work. So we cannot wait to do it after New Year, whatever. So we decide to start immediately. And the second thing is that this is a webinar session. So if any friends who are our traditional constituency, like ambassadors, deputies, or organization representatives, you're most welcome to join as a panelist. It doesn't mean you have to speak, but when you are logging as a panelist, I mean, afterwards during the Q&A, you can raise your hand and ask questions, make comments, so as to make our discussion more dynamic. The last thing I want to say before I give the floor back to Mercedes is that we have a panel, but this is a too big issue. So we do want to hear from others, our members, our constituencies, particularly Wendy, as we were discussing. And so we could have a richer discussion. And for those who are in, if you're not speaking, I would kindly ask you to mute yourself so we could have a kind of smooth discussion. So with that, back to you, Mercedes. Thank you very much for the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure for me to be moderating this panel with these fantastic partners of FMG. I mean, we have Alan Wolff, Ignacio Garcia Bercero, and Xinquan Tu. So I think this is a very varied group of panelists in a very particular time of our lives. We never thought that we will have a result of this election that will bring a president of the United States that will say we don't like free trade. But definitely that's what they are saying, announcing all this increase of tariffs. Even my country, Peru, had lately someone from the team of President-elected Trump saying that nobody should buy goods that go through a new port, a private port recently inaugurated in Peru, in which there are capitals from Peru and capitals from China. So this is the kind of things we are listening, and we are surprised. I've been in Mexico a couple of weeks ago. Also, the issues of trade are moving a lot. The exchange rate is moving because of that. So a lot of things are happening in the world. So I think we have to listen to the experts, and each one will have 15 minutes for their speech, but afterwards we have a nice time for conversation. So let's go, and I will ask Alan Wolff to be first in this moment.
Thank you very much, Mercedes, and thank you to FMG, those who have joined today. From the viewpoint of trade policy, the 2024 U.S. presidential election was clearly seen by the incoming administration as a referendum in favor of tariffs. And there will be tariffs. There will be additional tariffs for sure. Against which countries trade, for what purpose, and with what outcome, there's still open questions. The popular vote for Donald Trump was thin in terms of his margin, 49.79% to 48.31%. That's less than 1.5%. But it was seen as a landslide by the incoming administration, frankly, and by the Democrats who were shocked by losing. Even though the percentage basis, Trump's 2024 win was the fourth smallest since 1960. So while he had less than 50% of the popular vote, he feels he has the wind behind him for what he wants to do. a mandate to enact the policies he gave prominence to in his election bid, often talking about 10-20% tariffs on everyone from all sources and 60% for China. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he will be consistent and constant in exactly what he does. He'll have support from Congress. The Republicans, the president's party, won the House and the Senate, although again narrowly. 220 to 215 is the number of seats, with 3 seats up for election on the Republican side in the House. So it's a razor-thin majority, but it's enough with discipline, and 53 to 48 in the Senate. So it's a Republican Party that's peculiarly dominated by the president, I think, in this case, by Mr. Trump, in a way that we haven't seen, frankly, perhaps since FDR, since Franklin Roosevelt. On top of this, the Supreme Court is very pliant with respect to the incoming president's wishes, granting immunity from criminal acts for what he does, which is not particularly relevant here, other than the fact that it's a direction. Were there a legal challenge to anything he did in the trade area, the Supreme Court 6-3 in any event might be favorably disposed. We'll see. So why do I paint that picture? Because the normal restraints on presidential action are not clearly going to be very much present in this upcoming administration. And there won't be a referendum on Mr. Trump really until the midterm elections in 2026, in November 2026, when the American people have a chance to voice their approval or dismay or disapproval of whatever's taken place. Now, no government is monolithic. This is true of every government on the planet, not monolithic. To be in the Trump cabinet, one must be loyal to Trump. One must announce that one favors tariffs as a national policy. However, it's a pluralistic cabinet. Treasury and Commerce, Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick, are both finance executives. They aren't expected to want to see the United States withdraw from world trade. And Lutnick, as has been mentioned, has been given supposedly direct responsibility for USTR, which is not, I think peculiar circumstances led to that, but it's happened before. And you don't count out USTR. The trade professionals are very robust in the past, and I think in the future, again, at some point. They have very strong congressional support from 2 very important and powerful committees of the Congress, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, that set tariffs and tax policy. And the president needs those committees for his tax policies, not necessarily so much for his trade policies, because they've delegated a lot to begin with. USTR, Jameson Greer is a trade lawyer, former chief staff to Lighthizer. His recently stated objectives are very much strong on China, limiting China trade through leakage through Mexico and Canada. I suspect we'll see some activity on that score. He has talked in favor of turning over retaliation revenue against China to firms adversely affected by Chinese policies, coercion. He is in favor of regulating U.S. outbound investment. He has been testified in favor of granting subsidies to key U.S. industries. He is in favor of strong national security export controls, is on record in that regard, and eliminating China from government procurement. So a lot of China aspects there. I would also say that the trade professionals are dismayed at what's happened in dispute settlement at the WTO, and that's one element that will be there. But they also are interested in negotiating agreements. They're the ones who do it, and they did it for most recently the USMCA, the redo of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and they are still the people who negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So there's a core of support for international engagement at USTR, but political direction from the president will be ultimately very important. At state, Marco Rubio is heavily focused on China and Russia. The White House National Security Advisor, who's been named, Mike Waltz, is a former Green Beret, hardliner on China. The White House Trade Advisor, if one wanted to add a random element, bring back Peter Navarro, which they have, and he'll make relations with other countries more interesting as to whether they survive Peter Navarro, but he hasn't gotten his way so far. To have tariff reciprocity on a line item basis. So you have a 10% tariff on cars, I'll make sure I have a 10%, the United States, have a 10% tariff on cars for your country, which leads to a several hundred thousand, if not more than that, tariff schedule for the United States that is in the control of foreigners. Whatever they do, we emulate. I don't know that that ever sees the light of day, or at least not enacted. White House NEC Chair Kevin Hassett is traditional, has been in the first Trump administration, conventional economist. So look for sort of conventional good sense from Treasury and Commerce as at the cabinet level, as well as the NEC, National Economic Council Chair. The ambassador to China just named, David Perdue. This is interesting because he's a former CEO of Reebok and Dollar General, heavily dependent on trade with Asia for all of his past career. And he'll have some say in all of this. Outside the government, we have Elon Musk, who just, besides carving up the US government and shrinking it, has some interests of his own with respect to trade with China and trade with the rest of the world, and may have some influence going forward. I don't count out Bob Lighthizer. Not just that he lives a stone's throw from Mar-a-Lago, but Trump likes him, relies on him. He's a strong supporter of using tariffs in a different sense, I think, to dampen U.S. consumption and to foster U.S., although he wouldn't put it that way, but to foster U.S. renaissance in manufacturing. The United States doesn't have a value-added tax, and the sort of the Lighthizer approach is sort of a partial tax on consumption through tariffs. Congress, we've talked about the fact that they're there, and it's a Republican majority. The president doesn't need legislation for most of his tariff actions, and wouldn't, for example, for the recently announced Mexico and Canada tariffs at 25%. Johannes Fritz has Simon Evenet's colleague at IMD has done a paper on this. I have also at Peterson have done papers on this subject as to trade authorities. There's a lot of trade authority that's been delegated, including trade authority for China. And it's interesting that the president announced, instead of 60%, 10% additional tariff on China. But I wouldn't expect much in the way of guardrails from Congress initially. We'll see if they ever develop some more attitude that their authority really goes to tariffs under the Constitution. And but I don't expect them to take back much of that authority. But there are some in Congress who will see that as something they ought to be doing. what do we expect for the world trading system, for the WTO, from the United States? Trump's declared objectives with respect to use of tariffs is first, leverage to get another country to do what he wants, whether it's fentanyl across the border or migrants, whether it's a country that's making war and he wants them to enter into peace negotiations, whatever it is, the issue du jour, the BRICS use of the dollar as their currency, that's one purpose, leverage. Secondly, fund the income tax reductions that Trump plans. He likes the idea of tariff revenues, and sort of the fact that foreigners will, in his view, pay the tax is sort of at war with the idea that somehow this will all net out in a favorable way. The third is eliminate the trade deficit bilaterally. Mexico, Canada, and China, the first targets of the new, and Trump has somehow taken office without having taken office. I mean, he doesn't take office until January 20th, but he's already negotiating or putting out feelers for negotiations with his tariff pronouncements. They happen to be the three largest trade deficit countries with the United States that the United States has. So German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in different circumstances, talked about there being a real shitstorm. I think that would sum up what the outlook is for U.S. trade policy for others, as seen from other countries. Inclement weather. But the stock market doesn't think so. The Dow industrials are up 3.4% from November 6th to today, to yesterday. The stock market does not think that Trump is going to cause chaos, including chaos to world trade. It would be inconsistent with what they're pricing in. In terms of U.S. participation in the WTO, the U.S. will ignore any and all obligations with abandon. Articles 1 and 2 are gone, non-discrimination and tariff commitments. And Trump, as I say, is not even in office, as he's abandoning any obligations, not knowingly, but it's nevertheless the fact. De facto, the U.S. is withdrawing from the WTO. Hasn't been much there during the last administration, and the administration before that, frankly. So 8 years of the U.S. abandoning leadership. This is, and ignoring, for example, in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden administration, subsidy obligations. So obligations as a constraint on U.S. policy is not really something that we will see. A lot will depend upon how other countries react. Do they offer blandishments? They offer gifts to the incoming administration, and everything gets settled, and everyone is more or less sullen, but not miserable to too great an extent. Or do they retaliate, and do they counter-retaliate? So the bottom line, I think, and I'll close with this, is my best estimate is we get sort of a middle case. I'm not sure that the 25% tariff against Mexico and Canada necessarily disappear, but end up lower, for example, because of declared wins by the incoming president. And we're in a period of negotiation. I'll stop there and listen to Ignacio and Professor Tu, and look forward to their insights.
Thank you, Alan. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of questions that we have, but that's interesting that you're focusing on the renegotiation of USMCA and the lack of will to be in WTO. So I will pass the floor to Ignacio Garcia Bercero. Please, it's your time.
Thanks a lot, Mercedes, and it's always great to talk after Alan Wolff, who I think has very well set out the scene. I will be focusing my intervention not so much about on what the US might do, but much more in terms of what are the implications for the WTO and what the rest of the world should do. Now, just however, one little comment on what Alan has said. There's, of course, a lot of uncertainties, but it is clear that there will be tariffs. Now, if what President-elect Trump has announced is actually going to be implemented, let's be clear about the implications of what this means. It would mean full decoupling between the United States and China, and it would mean the United States reversing all the tariff liberalization that it undertook since 1947. So I would tend to agree with Alan, if that is what the US actually does, the US would de facto be outside the WTO. Now, I think de facto vis-a-vis the euro is, however, important, because no one would really want the US to abandon the WTO, knowing that that would probably mean that this step would be irreversible. It would be difficult to see how the US in the future could join back the WTO if it now decides to leave. I mean, I also agree that Jameson Greer in USTR is probably not a bad news. We need to see what team is going to be working with him, who will be the next WTO ambassador. There have been quite a few people working with him who know about the WTO, so we will need to see who the whole team is going to be. It will also be interesting to try to understand what is the narrative that the United States is going to be developing in the WTO. I mean, if it comes to China, I think there's already an established narrative, so I don't think that this implies so much of a change of narrative. But if the United States is going to justify ignoring its Article 2 commitments to increase tariffs to 10 and 20%, they will need to find some way of explaining that action also in terms of their WTO if they continue to be there. But as I said, I don't want to talk so much about what the US might or might not do. I want to focus much more on what are the implications that this has for the WTO. And I think that in my view, there are three potential scenarios about how things could develop during the next 4 years. Not all of them are equally likely, but I think I would mention the three of them. The first one is very unlikely, but however, I know that there are some people in the US who are talking about that, so I would mention it, is what I would call the bifurcation scenario, implying that it's not only the United States that takes this action vis-a-vis China, but they manage to get other countries to take a similar type of action, so that de facto you have not only the US, but also a significant number of countries acting at least vis-a-vis China outside of the WTO rules. And then China would try to see how far they can lead what is actually left of the WTO. Now, I think this is a very unlikely scenario. And I think it's a very unlikely scenario because, in my view, neither the US nor China have the leadership capacity to make this happen. Because for this to happen, the US will have to offer to those who are ready to side with them compensation for losing the China market. And China will need to undertake a major reform of its economy if it was going to also try to compensate others from losing the US market. So in my view, this bifurcation scenario, although I know that there is a speculation about that mostly in Washington, I don't really think that it is very plausible or very likely. Now, the second scenario is what I would call, depending on whether one wants to be an optimist or whether one wants to be a pessimist, the stagnation collapse scenario. Now, under that scenario, not much will happen in the WTO over the next 4 years. I mean, the WTO will continue being there, will produce reports, the committees will be working, they may even be able to agree on some small things here and there, but not much will happen in the WTO. But a lot of things will be happening outside the WTO. I mean, you could actually begin to see a proliferation of countries making offers to the US in order to avoid tariffs, offers that would imply ignoring the non-discrimination rules of the WTO. By the way, I see China as one of the countries that might be tempted to go in that direction. And of course, if that becomes the dynamic, if a significant number of countries decide to ignore the rules and enter into all kinds of transactional deals with the US, then in my view, we are getting quite close to the collapse type of the scenario. Now, is that going to happen or not? I do not know, but I mean, certainly I think this type of scenario is a significant risk. Now, the third scenario is the more optimistic one, which is one could call the reform scenario, making sure that the process of WTO reform continues to be on track, even knowing that during the next 4 years, most of the things that will happen will be under different forms of plurilateral configuration. It would not be possible to agree on too many things multilaterally. Now, the real challenge for this scenario is leadership. Who would be ready to take a leading role to keep the process of WTO reform on track, knowing that it cannot be the United States, it cannot be China. You need to be able to identify an alternative group of countries which are ready to play a leadership role. Now, this is not going to be simple. It would not happen by default, but from my point of view, would be the most desirable type of a scenario for the WTO in the next 4 years. Now, ideally, I think that the objective should be to try to get behind this reform agenda the European Union, the CTPP countries, Mercosur, and most of Latin America. And I mentioned Mercosur because there are very good news today. The European Union and the Mercosur have finally politically concluded their negotiations on the free trade agreement. And then the most challenging but very important issue, one should really try to bring Africa as much as possible into this reform coalition. And I say that because of the fact that the MC14 is going to be in Africa, the Director General is African, and South Africa is going to be leading the G20 next year. So finding the way to also get Africa into this reform coalition, in my view, that's going to be absolutely critical for such an approach to be able to work. Now, as I said, this is not going to happen automatically. It will require a small group of ministers to decide that they want to spend political capital and time in building this coalition. I mean, I hope that Maroš Šefčovič will be one of those ministers, but obviously I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Commission anymore. I'm just expressing my wishes. Now, what could be the content of such a reform agenda? I would basically identify 4 elements. Now, first one, of course, is dispute settlement. Now, taking into account where we are, what can be done on dispute settlement is, in my view, 3 things. To try to expand as much as possible the MPIA. Beyond the MPIA, to try to get as many countries as possible to commit not to appeal into the void, and to keep the conversation on WTO, on dispute settlement reform, open, even if it's not likely to produce results over the next 4 years. Keeping the conversation open may make it possible at the right moment to arrive at a multilateral solution on dispute settlement reform. So those are the 3 elements that I would actually recommend when it comes to dispute settlement. The second element would be the 16 GSIs, by which I mean basically investment facilitation and e-commerce. I think that a real effort needs to be made to discuss with South Africa and India where they can lift their objection to integrate investment facilitation for development in the WTO, and to do that during the time when South Africa has the G20 presidency, not to wait until MC14, probably together with a process of discussing what could be the way forward more generally for open plurilateral agreements and the Annex 4. This should be a conversation to have with South Africa and with India. Of course, if this conversation does not move forward, then I think that those who have participated in those agreements should be ready to move ahead and implement them. Now, the third element, I don't think that reform in the WTO has a lot of meaning unless it is really ready to tackle the issues that really matter in international trade. And we all know that the critical issue that really matters is the issue of subsidies. So I think you need to be able to have a process of discussions on issues relating to both agricultural subsidies and industrial subsidies. Now, there are process of discussion officially on agricultural reform. There is off-campus discussions on industrial subsidies. But in my view, what is really more important is that a smaller group of countries begin to think seriously about what could be the content of a reform in both areas, both on agriculture and on industrial subsidies. In my view, when it comes to agriculture, what could be very useful, but I don't know whether that is possible or not, is to have more intensive discussions between the Cairns Group and the European Union on domestic support, to try to see to what extent both sides can see a way forward for the reform of the rules on domestic support. And when it comes to industrial subsidies, my sense is that the place where one could have more intensive discussions to elaborate ideas about how to reform the rules could actually be in the context of the Ottawa Group. Finally, I think looking into MC14, the MC14 going to take place in Africa, I think it would be very important to begin to reflect upon what could be a meaningful but doable development package for MC14. And I see two elements on which reflection would be useful to undertake. One is food security, particularly for these developed countries and net food import in developing countries. And the other one is how trade policy action can help developing countries in the process of taking action for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So these are two development-related initiatives, which I think not clear whether it's possible to do it multilaterally. It might have to be done plurilaterally, but our work should really start between now and NC14 to see what can be done by that point in time. Now, it goes without saying that all of these ideas should be open to participation by all WTO members, including obviously China and the United States. And I have little doubt that China will probably be able to join and participate in most of these initiatives. I don't think they should lead, because if they actually lead, then it's very unlikely that we will ever be able to get the United States on board. But in principle, all of these different elements should be open for participation by the US, China, or any other member of the WTO. So I think I will leave it there. These are my suggestions about what could be done. Of course, we need to be ready for all the scenarios, including a disruptive scenario in which the United States starts blocking different activities in the WTO. But I don't think that we should assume that that is necessary to be what it is going to happen. But it's very clear that we cannot expect leadership, and if there's going to be leadership, someone else would need to provide it. Just finally, a little advertisement. Together with Andres Sapir and Petros Mavridis, who I see is also here, we are publishing a paper in Bruegel that will be out next Monday, which looks into the Trump tariffs and what we recommend the European Union reaction should be in relation to those tariffs if they are adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio. And very interesting your point of view from the side of WTO and how we can see the different scenarios that we may see worldwide in the future agreements. Now is the turn for Xinquan Tu. So please, Xinquan Tu, please help us know a little bit from your point of view in China.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss these interesting questions today with all the friends of multilateralism. I think I'm supposed to speak on behalf of China. Actually, Lou is a better spokesman since this was his official job for a long time. But now he's trying to be neutral. So I will take this tough job for this time. Trump's election or re-election is no surprise to us. We have been watching the elections in the US for a while, but actually we have nothing to do about it. We have to accept whatever outcomes of the election. To some extent, what is happening now is repeating the recent history as 8 years ago. In 2016, Trump said he would impose 45 tariffs on China. This time he said it will be 60%. So the difference is only 15%. So not so big deal. And actually, Trump has made some success since 2017. We all know that the U.S. goods trade deficit with China was reduced from 374 billion in 2017 to 278 billion in 2023. So now China is not the largest source of U.S. trade deficit. But on the other side, the U.S. total deficit rose from 800 billion to 1,063 billion during the period. So in this sense, his trade policy is not so successful. And China's economic growth has been slowing down due to various reasons, among which, of course, the U.S. trade war is one of them. But China is still growing faster than the U.S. in real terms. So it's difficult to say, right? Trump is successful in this sense. But in terms of Trump's election, the impact of Trump's election on global trade or WTO, I would like to go back further to the older history of the multilateral trading system. We all know that after the end of the Second World War, the United States had worked hard to promote the market economy mechanism in order to establish a US-led international economic system. In comparison to the old imperialist system before the Second World War, the most admirable merit of the US-led system is the political equality among the members, meaning that no country has a political superiority to exploit or despoil the others. Countries are voluntary to join the system, and it is basically the market economy mechanism deciding the international economic relationship among members. Therefore, every country under the system can develop their economies and international competitiveness on the basis of their own comparative advantage. The supremacy of the US in the first 2 decades gave it high self-confidence in its competitiveness, as well as great tolerance and even strong support of other emerging competitors. Like Japan was actually invited by the United States to join the GATT in 1955, mainly for the sake of fostering a powerful East Asian ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and China. But in terms of economic and industrial competition, the US was actually breeding a powerful competitor and made great success soon. Even early from late 1950s, the US had been struggling to deal with the shocks from Japan in a variety of industries, such as textile, steel, automobile, and semiconductor. The United States invented a number of tools, such as Section 301 and voluntary export restraints, to reduce the imports and increase the exports beyond the framework of the GATT. At that time, trade policy of Reagan administration was termed as aggressive unilateralism by some American scholars. Besides, the US government also tried its best to contain the space of technological and industrial upgradation of Japan in strategic industries like semiconductor and large aircraft, although Japan was a US strategic ally. Especially Japan was criticized for its special economic regime and practices, in particular the widespread government interventions. So you can see what the US had done to Japan and the GATT in the 1980s is quite similar to what the US has been doing to China and the WTO since 2018. So I think the biggest dilemma of the US-led rules-based and market-oriented international economic system is that the system will always breed and foster new competitors, thanks to its fairer market economic mechanism. But as long as there is a peer competitor emerging and the leader is facing serious challenges, and losing its self-confidence, its willingness to support and even abide by the system will decline accordingly. Therefore, the leader itself will break the system and try to contain the development of the competitor. Of course, there are also significant differences between Japan and China, as well as between history and the present. One is that in the first 2 or 3 decades of reform and opening up, China had a very high ratio of processing trade, which was largely contributed by foreign invested companies, meaning that China was part of global value chains controlled by foreign multinationals, especially those from the US. So American companies were also benefiting from China's trade surplus with the US. But Japan was never so open to foreign investors. The ratio of inward FDI to GDP of Japan has been about 1% for many decades, while China's ratio was as high as 7% in early 2000 years. Another difference is, although China has had a huge trade surplus with the US, there was little direct competition between US and China in major manufacturing industries. The so-called the first edition of China shock resulted in some unemployment in some labor-intensive industries, but China did not pose a threat to those core industries of the US. In contrast, in the 1980s, Japan was directly competing with the US in almost all major industries. So China did not pose an imminent threat to US industries in the early decades. These differences probably could explain why the US had been eager or keen to integrate China into the international economic system from Clinton to Obama administration. In the 1990s, there were debates in the US about how to deal with China, but the focus was more about China's political system and human rights, rather than China's potential as an economic competitor. And finally, the Clinton administration decided to deepen economic relations with China and try to benefit from China's economic growth. Then in 1999, the US finished its negotiations with China about its WTO membership. Interestingly, in the year of 2001, when China joined the WTO, China replaced Japan as the largest source of US trade deficit. But still, the US was trying to engage with China under the institutionalized multilateral framework. Even in the Obama administration, the two sides were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, which was very close to success. However, US trade policy toward China made a dramatic change to unilateral approach after Trump took the office. In retrospect, Made in China 2025 and Huawei's leading position in 5G might be important alarm bells for the US. The two events indicated that China was not only intending to get rich, but also to compete with US companies and technologies in strategic industries. Also, due to some domestic political changes in both countries, the US started a full-blown trade war against China in 2018 without international rules in mind anymore. So to some extent, the WTO is a kind of a collateral victim of US trade policy changes vis-a-vis China. The fundamental problem for today's multilateral trading system is the old leader believes that the emerging competitor is threatening its supremacy with the help of the system, and then its best response is to damage or destroy the system. China, of course, is the top target of Trump's trade agenda. The reason is also clear. China is still one of the largest sources of trade deficit, and especially China is the largest manufacturing nation in the world, representing almost 30% of world manufacturing value added. And China is considered almost unanimously as the only nation with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective, as said by State Secretary Blinken. What Trump wants most in trade is to rebalance US-China trade and stop or slow down China's catch-up. But for China, there is also a dilemma. The better China prepares for decoupling, the more decoupling there will be. Because what China can prepare for decoupling is to reduce its dependence on the US and then to decouple with the US further. So this will be an unavoidable downward spiral or vicious cycle. So I don't think China has many things to do bilaterally with the US. We will not surrender or give up our development. China will continue to do what it considers right or necessary. One good example is semiconductor. Japan was getting close to the US in the semiconductor technology and industry. However, the US set a ceiling on Japan and deprived of its freedom and opportunity to develop its semiconductor industry. But China won't follow US orders or prohibitions. Quite opposite. The more restrictions the US imposes, the more inputs China will make. So as shown just by the recent statements of China's several industrial associations. However, one lesson from the trade war in Trump 1.0 is that tit-for-tat retaliations were neither useful nor beneficial. So in China, there are basically two consensus about how to react to Trump's possible actions or attacks. The first is to take care of our own business, meaning that China should try its best to develop its economy more on the basis of domestic market. On the one hand, the government should support more private companies to enhance our productivity and efficiency. On the other hand, the government should distribute more resources to the household sector to stimulate domestic consumption. And the second consensus is to keep and expand our openness to the world, even including the United States, through a variety of approaches, including unilateral liberalization, regional integration, and multilateral engagement. In terms of WTO, China still very much appreciates the importance of the WTO, although we are aware that the WTO cannot constrain the US. As Alan just said, the US is withdrawing from the WTO. But another value of the WTO for China is to improve its international image and reputation as a defender of the rules-based international trade order. The Chinese people and the government care much about China's reputation in international society. So China is still endeavoring to comply with WTO rules and the obligations to make a good example in front of the world and in comparison or in contrast to the United States. And also China is very active in terms of joining WTO negotiations and making our own contributions to the progress of WTO negotiations. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you too for your presentation. It was very interesting that in China is already building, China is building inside their country this kind of consensus is to see how they are focusing in their inside, in own market, and also working with a trade liberalization, not with open markets in general, but also talking about bilaterals and regionalism as an instrument too. I will add to that probably foreign investment in many countries. That is also another issue that is moving forward. So that's an interesting point of view. Well, thank you very much for the three panelists because they were very strict with their time. So we have time to hear more conversations around. And since Lu asked Wendy from the beginning that she can contribute to this discussion, I invite Wendy to talk with us of her own points of view.
Well, thanks a lot. And I really enjoyed the past few presentations. I think the last presentation, I could probably offer a million counterpoints, but let's not have that debate. But I think it's good to have all these issues on the table. I thought I would just use my few minutes just to talk a bit about what I'm expecting. From this administration on trade. And I think Alan really laid out a lot of the politics and the fact that we're kind of in a new world and we can't rely on a lot of the traditional constraints on the executive branch on trade that have weighed in before. We are going to see tariffs. We don't know which ones. There are lots of proposals on the table. And I would caution everyone on this call not to respond and react to every proposal, because some of them will, they're subject of a tweet and we probably won't hear about them again. But I do think we're going to see some version of a high tariff on China, which in my view will be additive. So it's going to add on to the existing tariffs with China, which could then lead to very, very high tariffs in China, suggesting more of a decoupling objective than actually a negotiating objective. And I think we'll also see some version of tariffs on particularly the high deficit countries. And here I know Canada, Mexico, China have been named, but my European friends are probably on this list, Vietnam, and Japan, Korea, even Thailand, we'll see. But I think some of these tariffs are definitely coming. Before this call, I did go back and read and listen to things that Jamieson Greer, the USTR nominee, has said particularly about the WTO, and to share them. And I would encourage people to read his testimony before Ways and Means Committee, as well as the China Select Committee, I think in the past year or two, which will give you a lot of insights into where he's coming out on these issues. I think it's fair to say that Greer is a skeptic of the WTO, but my sense is that he's not interested in kind of blowing up the organization. But I think, as Alan noted, the WTO rules were not going to be constraints on what he feels and what the administration feels that it needs to do. And he will rely heavily on U.S. trade laws, but he's also talked a lot about thinking out of the box, thinking about new tools, improving U.S. trade laws. And one area that I would just put on people's radar screens to pay attention to are the idea of strengthening rules of origin. I think that is going to be kind of a sleeper issue, and most people around the world are not going to understand it. People on this call do, but rules of origin have such a direct impact on the application of tariffs that I think that will be a tool that is going to be looked at both with respect to our existing free trade agreements, but also with respect to further discussions with other countries. And then I just wanted to put on the table, with respect to the WTO, what I take away from what Greer has said, and some of this does, and I'll highlight where it comes from Lighthizer too. I think the first concern with the WTO, and it's from a U.S. perspective, that the rules don't cover Chinese practices. And so therefore, there is a big problem here where the United States and others are supposed to live up to all these rules, but China kind of gets a free pass because a lot of its trade practices are not covered, including issues related to state-owned enterprises, to labor, to excess capacity, and subsidies. Second, there is a great concern that the national security exception is not working, and that this should be a self-judging exception, and a real disbelief and horror that dispute settlement bodies can vote on whether they think a country has a national security justification for moving forward. Three, and here this comes this is something Lighthizer talked a lot about, but Jameson's out there too on this a bit. And this is the idea of whatever you want to call it, unbinding tariffs, resetting tariff schedules, et cetera. And, you know, a real discussion internally about the way the current WTO market access commitments are codified. It puts the US in a real disadvantage and doesn't anticipate changes and developments with respect to countries' development and where they should be, you know, the notion you lock in your tariff bindings forever. 4, he has opined about weakening the TRIPS agreement and intellectual property protection obligations. And so I'm just putting that on the table as well. And then 5th, and this kind of gets to one of Ignacio's recommendations for Africa, a real concern about what a developing country is and that preferences should go to least developing countries, and the whole, you know, self-declaration of developing country status is, you know, something that is objectionable. So I wanted to put that stuff on the table for discussion, and I would just echo, and now I can't remember who said it. I think it was Alan, or no, maybe it's Ignacio. I think an early clue about how the U.S. will view the WTO will indeed be who is nominated to be our ambassador to the WTO. And, you know, is it going to be a political type who wants to take on China? Or is it going to be more of a professional person who's going to try and work through these issues constructively? But I would just caution everyone, I don't see the United States returning to any leadership role. And I think the best we can do is kind of get through the next 4 years with respect to the WTO and do what, you know, accomplish what the WTO members can accomplish. And as Ignacio said, try and see if the plurilateral approach is something that can really get off the ground and be implemented, because without that, I think that we're headed towards even more problems that go way beyond how Trump and this administration will view the WTO.
Thank you, Wendy, to put in. Thank you, Wendy. Really, I really like that you put these 5 issues into the discussion, because they are very important. And also the issue of rule of origin. There was a question I had about that, because a few weeks ago, I was talking with a colleague and another economist in Mexico, and they were talking about the MCA. And one thing that he was saying, why don't we transform this FTA in a custom union? And I say, and I think that's harder for you also for Mexico, but probably, why don't you think about rules of origin? And there are many countries that have free trade agreements with the US. That was the purpose of the CPTPP. I mean, the TPP was in some way a manner to increase and promote rules of origin for the members that were there, you know, and use that ability. So probably rules of origin will be a very interesting way to see how it develops for US. So that's also, of course, discrimination, but it's a discrimination with further ambitions, you know, to have all this building. But I like the idea you have that. Well, I see some hands are raised. First is Lou, and of course, afterwards is Alejandro.
Thank you, Mercedes. So many thanks to the 3 speakers and also Wendy, really enlightening. I mean, as CEO of FMG, not like my previous life, as Xinquan said, as the big mouth of Chinese mission in Geneva, I want to make 2 quick comments. The first one, before I start, actually, our common friend, Arancha Gonzalez, a few days ago was making a speech on US election, what the big Europe, not only the EU, should respond. She said something very interesting. So she said 3 problems. So US, China, US and China. So that's exactly what we are discussing here. My first comment is that, so with incoming all kinds of challenges and tariffs, so on and so forth. First, how do we react? The first is that how we as countries, the trading partners of the US react. The first thing Ignacio said, it is right that probably we should not surrender and to the US pressure by doing too many things like they do, unconstrained by WTO rules. So that will be a kind of big problem. And the second thing is that how do we retaliate? I mean, as politicians, we know that they would have to retaliate if the US launched this tariff war, not only on China, but on other countries. But how do we moderate that retaliation with tariffs or whatever, so that we don't escalate into a kind of worldwide tariff war, and which, of course, will be beneficial for nobody, including US and many others. So on that, I want to mention that actually Alejandro, who is going to take the floor, has something very interesting on his T-shirt. I will just read it out. So tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary policy aims and foster political dysfunction along the way. So I think that's what we need to know. The second thing is that as the WTO, the organization, the system, how do we collectively engage US? Of course, we are saying that US would disengage, would not be leading, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean we should not do anything. I think that we need to develop a kind of some new narratives to persuade Trump, who is not a WTO expert, about the importance of the system and of the organization to the US economy and its future development. I think that's still something very true there. And the second thing, I like the way Ignacio tabled kind of some things to do on the way ahead, including plurilaterals, climate, subsidies, and others. Of course, I think there are probably something to add up onto that, especially on development side. But I do think that that's the way forward, is that to develop a kind of reform agenda. One way or the other, we could at least have the interest from the US governments and as well as the private sector, and probably that will in a way that engage them. So that's something at least we should do. I'll just stop here. Thanks a lot again. Yeah.
Thank you, Lou. Alejandro. And then John is after him.
Thank you very much, Mercedes, and thanks to our speakers today. They've had fantastic contributions, and I've learned a lot from them. To keep this brief, I'd like to make a point. I like Ignacio's idea of a reform coalition. And I think that that should be something that should be done as early as possible, and regardless of the measures the United States takes. This should not be seen as something against the United States or trying to isolate the United States. It should be done in a more general context, because things are slowed down in Geneva. Countries like India sometimes object to these kind of groups and so on, or South Africa, and so forth. A few days ago, at a meeting, a different context, a different format, Patrick Lowe raised the question whether the WTO is and will be an effective constraint against protectionism, or words to that effect. And increasingly so, WTO is a very weak constraint. Let me say, at another meeting, some people dealing with trade in my part of the world, suggestion was made about industrial policy, local content requirements, and so on. I raised a point about conformity with the rules of the WTO, and the reply I got from two of those participants was, but the WTO doesn't matter anymore. Nobody's paying attention or respecting the rules of the game. So that's commonplace in today's world, and I think this attitude is on the rise. Fortunately, at least for some of our countries, WTO rules and obligations are incorporated into domestic law. So it's quite difficult for the government to go against its own law. But how long would that hold? I don't know. So in that respect, this reform coalition of Ignacio's, as one of its standing principles, should start by committing themselves to abide by the rules of the WTO, at least as far as trade amongst themselves is concerned. It's better if it would be across the board, but at the very least, and that should help maintain the WTO as some kind of constraint against protectionism. Thanks so much.
Thank you, John. And then Hamid, and if I'm not wrong, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. And I must say, I think we've really benefited this morning from 3 excellent presentations, and the one added on by Wendy. It really helps set the stage for some very good thinking on what we should be doing. I like Ignacio's third scenario, of course. I think we're probably all in favor of that, and I think we really need to think about what can we do individually and as a group to try to make that scenario become the more likely one rather than one of the first 2. I was struck by Xinquan's presentation, and I found it very interesting how he went back and looked at the situation with respect to Japan after it joined the GATT, and when that became more of a tension in the early 1980s, and a lot of voluntary export restraints were negotiated. That's when the voluntary export restraints really spread from the textile area into other products like automobiles, and a lot of people, and it did put a lot of pressure on the system. A lot of people at that time were saying the GATT was dead, particularly in the post-1982 period. So I think there are some similarities between the situation we face ourselves in now and then, although I think that the situation now is worse for a variety, and I won't go into that in any more detail. But I do think as we try to promote a reform agenda, we really need to be looking at perhaps going back and doing some of the things that were done in the 1980s, which while the discussion was focused in Geneva in the GATT as we work towards a new round of trade negotiations, there were a lot of constraints to having a good discussion in the GATT because, surprise, surprise, there were some countries that were opposed to any consideration of new directions and new ideas. And so one of the ways around this was to engage a broader group than just government officials in the GATT context, but really to look at getting academics, business people, officials, politicians, and not necessarily the ones who were in government at the time, engaged in various meetings in various places around the world and focusing on these issues. And I think that process was very important in helping us come towards the kind of consensus that eventually allowed us to launch the new negotiations that became the Uruguay round. I think this would be particularly valuable, this kind of approach too, because as somebody said a few minutes ago, I think it was Lou, that we really need to think of getting American business, for instance, engaged. Well, getting American business engaged in the WTO itself might be a little complicated, but I think you can certainly get them engaged in forward thinking about what sort of reform process we want to do, we want to see happen in the period ahead. Now, I don't think we're going to see any dramatic progress, to put it mildly, in the WTO over the next 4 years. I think we're basically looking at least at a 4-year period in which nothing is going to happen and really damage control and avoiding a breakup of the system is what we should be looking at, trying to minimize the damage. But I think this is also, therefore, a very good time to be really looking in a far-sighted way at some of these issues that we've touched on. And here Ignacio talked about subsidies, for instance, and both agriculture and industrial products. And I think that is really important. We've done some work on this in this group, of course, and clearly this has become the new industrial policy and the new protectionism sort of all at once. And I think that we could make a contribution by trying to move forward with ideas like that. Finally, I could say a lot more, but I'm going to stop now. But I would like to suggest that if they're willing, our 3 presenters this morning, would they be prepared to allow their remarks to be put on our website? And if not that, at least circulated to members of our group, because I think what they've said really would be valuable for a broader audience than just us, and would help turn the current public discussion of what's happening from a sort of doomsday set of scenario thinking down to some practical thoughts about what is likely to happen and what can we do about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will pass the floor to Hamid, then to Cecilia, and then to Hector, who was talking about some macroeconomic issues, and I would like to mention that. Given this, that there are a lot of people putting their hands up, I will suggest we stay 15 minutes more than the time that we had, so we have this conversation going, because I think this is very rich and informative for everyone. Please, Hamid.
Well, thank you so very much, Mercedes, and thank you for the excellent presentations we had before. Of course, a lot of enlightening thoughts. But my question here, which is a comment also at the same time, is that I don't think, of course, rivalries don't create systems. They don't build. Rivalries only, damage situations and institutions. And we are facing a situation now where we see what's coming more or less in the next 4 years. We're not going to speculate on the details, but we know the sense of direction. And I hear what John was just saying about we shouldn't expect much in the next 4 years. But my sense really is that this crisis did not start with Trump. And I don't think it will end by Trump leaving. I fear this is the reality of the situation in the WTO. There has been a shift that has been taking place since the financial crisis, which is the one entity that provided the leadership to build this system has backed off, and they're not interested in investing in that kind of leadership. So we need a different leadership formula. I like what Ignacio said about the coalition of the willing, if I may put it in those terms. The question is that coalition of the willing needs a champion, needs a convener. I think we are at a point now where we really, really need to make clear choices. We should not write off the next 4 years, but we should see whether we are capable, or the WTO members who really care about the system and feel that it's so important for them, are they caring enough, or do they have enough desire? Do they want it badly enough so that they can actually start having a well-structured process of deliberating reform steps? And if I look at the past 10, even more than 10 years, we have not been having the right kind of conversations in the WTO. That's a reality. There are certain things which are still subject to a lot of confusion now, even when we talk about plurilaterals. Are we talking about plurilateral negotiations? Because there are no rules there that require consensus. But we have been discussing for the past 3 years the lack of legal legitimacy for GSI negotiations. Now, if we're talking about outcomes, that's a completely different story. But we need conversations that clarify, where we are, clarify the way forward. And even those conversations require leadership, and that's what we're not having. So to what extent really do we see that there is a realization on the part of those who care about the system that what we have in the WTO is so precious in terms of the legal and treaty and institutional infrastructure that if it slips away, we will not be able to create anything like it for the next 2 generations at least. So maybe the Trump return is a call for action. I feel that we're really, really living in a very, very important moment here. And if we wait until the Trump 4 years pass, we might not actually be able to catch up. These are just some thoughts. I would be very much interested in the views of the panelists as well as other friends on the call. Thank you, Mercedes.
Thank you, Hamid. And I think the same, that we are in a very crucial time to make changes and think about how to do it. Thank you. Then Cecilia, please, Jonathan and Hector then.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your very interesting comments, all the speakers, and also those of you who made this. I think we are at a moment where we really need to think about how to saving the multilateral system and WTO. And I note that there are more and more countries who are actually very concerned and willing to step up. So I wanted to build upon what Ignacio said. I think that was very important, your point on coalition of the willing or those. I just came back from Singapore. The Peterson Institute had a conference together with the Singapore University there, and what we call a STEP conference. And we had the honor to have the visit of Dr. Ngozi, who was there, and also ministers from quite a lot of countries in the region. So this was a regional conference. I was the only European. There were a few Americans there, but there was nobody from Latin America or Africa. But that was a group also ministerial level and researchers and negotiators. So who were expressing the same thoughts that you were expressing, Ignacio, that we need really to move, those of us who want to do something in the WTO, we need to move forward. Maybe the MPAI could be made more formal, plurilateral, and having more countries joining. We should try to get the ongoing negotiations concluded, e-commerce. And there was a discussion of what else could be done by a group of countries who really want to see action in a smaller multilateral, but plurilateral, but in a multilateral spirit. And we talked about subsidies, as you did, a great need there. And we also talked about carbon pricing, whether the WTO can be, if not a rule setting, at least some sort of coordinating mechanism for all the different carbon pricing systems that are now emerging in the world. There are 75 different legal ones, and they are all good, but they are in a way competing. And WTO has, as you know, together with IMF, World Bank, UNCTAD, and OECD, published a report to map them, and they are now trying to work on a common methodology. So these were a few things we discussed there as well. I agree that we need a group of countries much bigger than that, obviously, some sort of Ottawa Group Plus, with Africa and Latin America participating. There are also some positive signs coming from Indonesia, where they are evaluating some of their trade policy. Our friend Marie Pangestu is a special minister responsible for that, and she's doing a hard job there. So maybe we can count on a more active Indonesia in the future. Will not be easy, but I think this is what we need to do. It will be hard to move with the US, maybe with China. But those of us who care about the system, and if China wants to join, I think that is excellent. And then, if the US doesn't want to join, well, sorry, they can come on later. My boss, Adam Poser, used to say that you either lead, you follow, or you get out of the way. And if they want to get out of the way, there are at least 163 countries who can move forward, and someone there should take the leadership. So very important that we move on with this discussion in this group as well, because there's a lot of competence and experience there. So thank you very much, especially Ignacio, for raising this.
Thank you, Cecilia. Fantastic information. And Jonathan, please.
Sorry, let me just unmute. So one observation building on John Weeks' always insightful comments, and then one very specific question. The observation is, given the inevitability of significant stalemate, and given the allergy in Geneva to deliberative rather than negotiating settings, I think what's implicit in all of this is not to flog a dead horse and force it into a WTO meeting room, but rather to look at how FMG can catalyze better thinking in a variety of settings. You have APEC, you have the OECD, you have the Peterson Institute and counterparts in other capitals, as the Singapore conference demonstrates. You can rally and map out more strategically how to promote analysis and opinion that makes it into the public and public policy domain to foster directions for reform. And not to mention UNCTAD and some of the WTO's partners. And that takes you over to WIPO and so on. So I think implicit in John's remarks is to take a more strategic and more comprehensive review of fostering thinking. FMG can be a part of it, but we shouldn't delude ourselves into being alone in leading without rallying a broader public policy community alongside governmental discussions, as Cecilia suggests, whether the Ottawa Group Plus or other settings. So the very specific question is particularly for Alan, I guess, but others may have views. The other way that the United States has historically influenced WTO thinking is through, dare I say, the American Deputy Director General position. And I wonder if you have any reflections on Angela Ellard's future, or Wendy may have thoughts as well on possible successors, because that becomes a key element of the constellation of voices in the new administration as well. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Please, Hector, and then Robert. Hector, we cannot hear you. Can you turn
I'm
your
sorry,
mic?
I'm unmuting now. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Sorry, I was outside. That was I first sent a comment. Basically what I want to say is that Trump, of course, is creating havoc, but China's main problem is not Trump. China's main problem is an inconsistency between a savings rate, a domestic savings rate annually of 45%, equivalent to 45% of the GDP, mostly repressed domestically because the capital account is not open, and frugal consumption families. So that is an explosive cocktail that makes China quite vulnerable to exports. Up to now, China has managed to, the powerhouse of China's growth has been investment and in infrastructure and real estate. But as we all know, that has run its course. So China now is vulnerable to what Trump is aiming to exploit. Now, of course, China can react to this. It can do something about it. The most obvious thing would be start opening the capital account. I don't know if that they're prepared for that. I believe they're not. And I even would warn them not to do that in any kind of rush, because the consequences could be terrible. Then the other one is, of course, it requires a cultural change, which means increased consumption. But you cannot change the culture from one day to the other. So definitely that puts us all the rest somehow exposed to what China doesn't want to hear about, but is over capacity. So that's the situation. Trump is just going to be exploiting that. In my view, he will be the last nail to a rules-based system that is agonizing, and he will want to replace that with a deals-based system with the US at its center. Now, that is a horrible perspective for countries, that middle power countries, definitely. Maybe it's horrible as well for countries like the EU. But we should start thinking about a fact. I mean, I think that we are moving into a very different dimension. This is a rules, forget about the rules-based system, despite how much we like that. This is going to be a deals-based system run by Trump, by the United States mainly. So I think we should, I think you're over-optimistic about what we can do at the WTO in this next 4 years. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you, Hector, to introducing the macroeconomic issues. I would like to mention too that the trade policy will have effects in the macroeconomics of the world. I mean, the interest rate won't go down as fast as it should. And of course, that will make the economic behavior of the US slower, and also the rest of the world. Also, the problems that we will have on exchange rates that probably will be affected by that, and that will probably reduce opportunities of exporting for many countries of the world. So this is an interesting issue we should focus to. Please, Robert.
Thanks, Mercedes. I'm sort of following up a bit on Hector's. I guess you get the two economists here. So much discussion lately has been around whether or not Trump's trade policy positioning and his appointments for Treasury and Commerce and other advisors are really sort of working us back towards an updated Plaza Accord. And frankly, I've said this before in the past on these meetings here, the economic analysis clearly demonstrates that tariffs don't work on the overall deficit, might move the bilateral deficit around. But they're not going to fix what I think is the driving force here, which is macro finance. So a question is, where are the finance ministers on this? I think the WTO is going to have real difficulties trying to reform and update with all the pressures being put on it that are really sourced on the macro finance side. How much of these problems are really bilateral trade issues that tariffs or other trade negotiations can fix? I think it's just an unreasonable expectation that the WTO is going to fix it. I did some work on this back in it was published in 2021, but it actually started in the late 2010s. It's in the China Economic Review, the structural change in China's economy and changing trade relations with the world, that asks the question, what happens if China fixes its underconsumption domestically? And even though the work is kind of old now, it's still pretty insightful, I think, if anybody wants to go take a look at that. Second is I provided a briefing the other day for senior civil servants at the Department of Commerce, both on what's happening in terms of global value chains, but also there was a smaller meeting afterwards with a separate set of senior folks on the WTO. They wanted my views, having been on the secretariat there. And I found it fascinating. These are not political appointees. They're going to be working with a new group of political appointees. Recording in progress. But these folks are going to have to work with the incoming politicals. And their questions really were around some very practical things. So it was mentioned about, I think Cecilia mentioned the very interesting joint work with the IMF and World Bank on climate policies. So that came up. Another thing that came up was the joint effort we did with the IMF and World Bank on subsidy measurement. And what was really interesting was the defensiveness of these civil servants. Why is the WTO collecting information on subsidies, right? Why is it working with the IMF and World Bank? You guys shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff, right? And it goes back to, I think, a historical view that I experienced as chief economist there, where many longtime WTO experts within the US government have this skeptical view that because the US is so transparent compared to other countries, that if the Secretariat works with other IOs and tries to develop an integrated database, essentially following the transparency provisions of the WTO, trying to provide a clearer picture of subsidies and their roles, we get questioned, right? I mean, I was questioned about that. I think Annabelle faced questions on that. And my reaction was, well, sure, your stuff is easily findable compared to other countries, but much of the effort is trying to find the information on the other countries. So if career civil servants who have deep expertise in the WTO and its operations are skeptical, complaining about, you know, EU efforts or Chinese efforts within the Secretariat, it isn't just the political level, I guess, is the bottom line to my point here. And, you know, there are lots of questions around the strategic plan presentation at the public forum. And my experience there was, you know, this stuff is trying to get more efficiency out, not trying to tell out of the Secretariat, not trying to tell members what to do. But it's still, the skepticism is pretty deep. And again, it's not just the political side. Okay, I'll stop there. Oh, but I'm sorry, there is one other point. I've done some recent work on the Trump tariffs. And consistent with the work done at the Peterson Institute by Warwick and Marcus Nolan, what I find is that this stuff is pretty inflationary. And it's the struggle of trying to reallocate resources to produce a lot of stuff that you used to import. That's going to increase the cost of capital, increase the cost of labor. Net welfare impacts are small, right? So people maybe don't like hearing that in the trade community. There are sectoral redistributions. The transition can be painful and costly. But if I were Trump, I'd be sitting there saying, I lose 0.1% and China loses 10 times that. I'm good with that, right? So there, now I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. So I will go back to our presenters. I think we should do the same way, Alan, then Ignacio, and then Tu, for answering or wrapping up what they see after this conversation.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. A very rich discussion, a lot of value. I concentrated on what the new administration meant, but I care a lot about how you recover from it, which was the focus of many of the other remarks. I might say that Hector and Bob Koopman raised extraordinarily important points, that rates of savings are going to play into this in a big way. When I was, as far as the US DDG is concerned, if there is another one, you can't move the world from that position. I met with Christine Lagarde when she was at the fund as managing director, and I met also with Kristalina Georgieva when she succeeded Christine Lagarde. And I said, we need the finance ministers to get involved in trade. Actually, that didn't work. They say, well, that in every government, they consider trade a separate silo at this point. But we do need the finance ministers involved. And maybe with the US, that's a way in, by the way, with the new cabinet. And not only Greer, but also Besant and maybe Lutnick. In terms of the private sector, U.S. business will be interested if something's going on that is of value to them. And it's not fish, as it turns out, really. It's, is something on e-commerce that could be done among some countries sufficiently of interest that those folks who are very important in the U.S. economy and around the world take an interest, that will attract them. Leadership. I look forward to I very much welcomed Ignacio's comments. I look forward to an EU that is deeply engaged in the WTO and multilateralism. I'm not sure that anybody in the United States will say, great that the Mercosur agreement has been agreed to. It's doing wonderful for the U.S. because no one in Brussels or in Latin America is saying to the U.S. why this is good for the trading system of the U.S. And I think that's an error that the Conservative Party in Britain learned when it never sold the EU to its own constituency. Well, that's somewhat what's happened with the WTO. It was not sold by the EU to its own people and not sold by the U.S. to its constituents. Rules of origin, just a footnote, they're not going to be any neutrals in the U.S.-China divide because they will be affected. So you can bet that this next administration will say, well, not so much Chinese content, thank you very much, is going to be in the redo, if there is a redo, of USMCA. If it survives, hopefully it does, there's going to be a lot of attention to rules of origin, as Wendy has said. With respect to Xinquan comments, there's a lot to be learned from the U.S., Japan, and Japan rest of world difficulties of the 1970s and 80s. It's not the same as Wendy said, but there's a need to deal with exchange rate. There's a need to deal with rates of savings. There's a need to deal with consumption. And there's a need to deal with U.S. consumption as well, which I think is what's going on with the 20%, 10% or 20% tariff, because the U.S. can't adopt a value-added tax. That those who backed that, some of them, weren't just tariff men or women. They were looking for changing the rate of consumption in the United States. MPIA, just last comment, it's hard to envisage an MPI negotiation without the United States that somehow takes into account U.S. interests. And that's going to be very difficult to do. So MPIA didn't do it. It was considered as a plot, a provocation, not an answer. It didn't bring back trade remedies to play a role, and populism tells us that there is a role to be played. And again, really last point, Alejandro said this should be a pledge of countries to resist protection. There should be a real discussion in the WTO General Council or elsewhere among countries, as there was some countries with respect to the pandemic took a pledge not to interfere with trade, unduly use trade as a positive tool to deal with the pandemic. Similarly, to deal with what's taking place today with respect to the bifurcation, as Ignacio has said, there should be active consultation to resist doing special deals that are discriminatory against others, that don't take into account the interests of others. And also, if there's retaliation, how is that retaliation confined so it doesn't bring down the system? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Xinquan, sorry.
Okay, thank you all the for all the comments and suggestions. I just have one point to add. I agree with Hector that there will be a dues-based system coming. But my hope is that I think for many countries there is no choice. And they have to make deals with the U.S. Because of a lot of reasons. But my hope is that those bilateral deals or regional deals with the U.S. Should not break the WTO rules, especially the non-discrimination principle. And they should not hurt the trade relations or trade interests with the third countries. I think otherwise these countries will become like a accomplice of the U.S. to break the multilateral system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio.
Yes, thanks a lot. So many great points were made. Let me try to be concise. Now, first to say that I hope I have not sounded too optimistic in the beginning, because if you want to hear from me my assessment about the more likely scenario, I think it's a scenario 2. That is to say, nothing really much happens in the WTO over the next 4 years. And unfortunately, a number of countries, including important trading countries, will be ready to enter into bilateral deals with the United States that do not respect this principle of non-discrimination. I mean, I was very reassured when I heard that China is not intending to do so, because quite frankly, I have heard in many places that China has been preparing a phase 2 agreement built under similar premises as phase 1. I hope that is not the case, but I think that that's something that obviously people are going to be watching very carefully what happens over the next few months. On the question of the coalition, I mean, I was really happy that so many of you appear to be interested in this idea. Now, this to be said, for a coalition to work, you are going to need to have 4 or 5 trade ministers that really have identified this issue as a high political priority and that are ready to employ capital in making this coalition happen. It's not something which is going just to happen by default. So the more that we actually discuss here in different places how to establish that coalition, the better. I will be very careful, however, about shifting too much the discussion to other institutions like the OECD. I mean, if we are not able to have those conversations in Geneva, not necessarily in formal meetings in the WTO, but in Geneva, if that is not going to happen, quite frankly, the perception which is already very, very spread that the WTO doesn't really matter, that the issues that really matter for trade are never being discussed in the WTO context, is something which is only going to become greater as time passes. Finally, of course, I totally agree with Robert and Hector that the fundamental contradiction of the policy of the United States is that if they actually really wanted to do something about the US deficit, then they would need to look into macroeconomic factors, including fundamentally the US budget deficit. There cannot be a Plaza Accord without a reduction of the US budget deficit, and the policies of the Trump administration go absolutely in the opposite direction. So what is going to happen is that these policies are not going to reduce the deficit. If anything, they're going to shift the deficit from some countries into others, but at the end of the day, the deficit is going to increase, and that's going to result in more pressures and more tensions in the trading system. Finally, just a little word on retaliation. As I said, we have been working together with some colleagues on a paper in Bruegel, where we would suggest what we think the European Union should do. But let me be very clear. I don't think that you are going to be in a position to have a serious discussion with the United States about how to try to avoid problems without being also ready, if necessary, to retaliate. So certainly we would recommend to the European Union that they need to have ready a credible retaliation option.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you all. I think this was a fantastic conversation, and we are just on time, so I don't want to add anything else. I don't know, Lou, if you want to say something about this conversation and how we move forward.
Thanks a lot, Mercedes, very much to you for the excellent moderation and the so rich discussion. We're coming close to Christmas time and the New Year, and of course today is rich discussion, but it's not a sweet pie for the holiday mood. I just want to say that this is probably the last FMG meeting by the end of 2024. So let me wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And we have a lot to do as we are discussing in 2025. And very soon you will hear from us. We are, other than WTO reform, some decision-making, other things to discuss. But we, the board, are also launching a new, how to say, initiative to have a kind of high-level dialogue with some key experts like Pascal Lamy and others to share their insights on the future of the WTO and the WTO reform. So I think that's something we're preparing to do. So stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you in 2025. Thanks a lot to you and all the panelists, and see you in 2025. Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.